The hum of fluorescent lights and muffled chatter filled the quiet corridors of the military complex. But Admiral Daniel Washington walked with purpose, his strides confident, his focus unwavering. He just wrapped up a grueling strategy meeting with top officials. A critical session that felt as though it held the weight of the nation on its shoulders. Hours of careful deliberation, tactical plans, and sleepless nights were all standard fare for Washington. But he carried it well. His mind was trained for these challenges, honed through decades of service to his country. As he left the building, the evening sky had darkened, casting long shadows across the tarmac. The city lights flickered in the distance. But Daniel had no interest in the usual private jets or military escorts offered to someone of his rank. Instead, he looked forward to a simple commercial flight back home. A choice he made consciously. A small but important way to stay connected to the everyday lives of the people he served. Despite the privileges his title afforded him, Daniel preferred to live with humility, a quality that distinguished him from many others in his field. Dressed in a plain white button-down shirt, dark jeans, and a jacket draped over his arm, he walked into the airport with the calm confidence of a man who knew his worth but didn't need to announce it. He blended easily into the crowd, a tall, fit figure moving steadily past clusters of travelers, most too busy with their own journeys to take notice of him. He wasn't in uniform. He rarely was outside the base. His insignias, medals, and the heavy weight of his titles were safely tucked away in his luggage, along with the legacy of battles won and men led. At the check-in counter, Daniel handed over his first-class ticket with a warm nod to the attendant. He was looking forward to seat 2A, a rare indulgence he granted himself after the exhausting week. The young woman behind the counter barely glanced at him, her fingers tapping methodically on the keyboard. He watched her, a polite smile lingering on his face, waiting for the usual pleasantries. Maybe a thank you for your service, or even a nod of recognition. But there was none, just silence. After a long pause, the woman finally looked up, her gaze cool and distant, and handed his ticket back. "Your seat has been reassigned," she said, her tone devoid of warmth or apology. "Unfortunately, we no longer have availability in first class." For a moment, Daniel's mind struggled to process her words, the exhaustion from the week clouding his thoughts. He blinked, catching himself before any irritation could surface. Reassigned? His seat had been confirmed days ago. This couldn't be right. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice steady but questioning, a subtle authority in his tone that he had earned over decades. "My reservation was confirmed." The attendant didn't meet his eyes, her attention drifting back to her computer screen as though his presence was an inconvenience, something to be dismissed. "No mistake, sir," she replied curtly. "We're fully booked. You've been moved to economy. You can board with Group 6. Daniel felt a small spark of something then, not anger, not yet, but the first flicker of frustration. He could have let it go. He could have boarded in economy, taken any seat they gave him, and let this be another minor inconvenience in his life. But it was the way she refused to look at him, the dismissive tone in her voice, that rooted him in place. "Is there a reason my seat was reassigned?" he asked, his voice still calm, though there was now an unmistakable firmness to it. The attendant's fingers paused over the keyboard, and she finally glanced up, her face expressionless. "It's an overbooking issue, sir. There's nothing I can do." Daniel's gaze didn't waver, but inside, he felt a familiar weight settle over him, the weight of being seen as less, of being brushed aside. It was an experience he thought he had left behind years ago, something he'd believed his rank and reputation would shield him from. Yet here it was, subtle but unmistakable, a quiet dismissal that resonated with the echoes of his past. He straightened, his calm demeanor unwavering, yet there was something formidable in his stance now, something that hinted at the quiet strength beneath his civilian clothes. For him, this wasn't just about a seat, it was about respect. And respect was something he had earned, both on the battlefield and off, through years of service and sacrifice. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor," he said, his voice clear, leaving no room for argument. The attendant hesitated, her polished indifference cracking just slightly. She gave a sharp nod and walked briskly toward the back, leaving Daniel alone at the counter. As he waited, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him. Passers-by glanced his way, their expressions curious. perhaps even judgmental, but he held his ground, his head high, his presence commanding even in silence. He knew, as he stood there, that this moment would test him not as an admiral, not as a leader, but as a man standing up for the respect he deserved. And he was ready. Admiral Washington waited patiently, his gaze fixed ahead as the minutes ticked by. But his mind was a current of thoughts, each one sharper than the last. He had been here before, not at an airport, not at this exact counter, but in moments where his presence was questioned, where respect was something to be fought for rather than freely given. He felt a cold reminder of past experiences that, no matter his achievements, he was often reduced to what some chose to see on the surface. The bustle of the airport swirled around him, passengers moving from line to line, laughing and chatting as they prepared for vacations or business trips. He saw the gleam of polished shoes, the flash of designer luggage, the effortless ease with which other first-class passengers were welcomed and ushered through. And here he was, standing alone, watched yet invisible. Finally, the attendant returned, accompanied by a man who looked every bit the part of a manager. Tidy suit, a calculated smile, and a demeanor practiced to handle complaints but reluctant to solve problems. The man's smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he stepped forward. "Good afternoon, sir." The supervisor began smoothly, folding his hands. "I understand there's been an issue with your seating assignment?" Daniel offered a small nod, but his eyes remained steady, his posture tall and composed. "Yes," he replied. "It appears my first-class seat was reassigned without notice, despite a confirmed reservation." The supervisor cast a quick glance toward the attendant, who stood a few paces back, her face carefully blank. He returned his gaze to the screen, typing briefly, before looking back up. "It appears we had an overbooking situation in first class, and we had to make some adjustments. We apologize for any inconvenience." It was a smooth answer, polished but hollow. Daniel could see through it instantly. Overbooking in first class? And yet, he noticed, there were no delays in welcoming other well-dressed, evidently affluent passengers to their seats. His voice remained calm, his gaze direct. "I see, and yet, it seems that others are being seated without issue." The supervisor's expression barely shifted, but Daniel noticed a flicker of discomfort, a subtle tightening around the man's eyes. "I assure you, sir, this is standard procedure. We strive to accommodate all passengers to the best of our ability." There it was again, that tone of polite dismissal, thinly masking a lack of genuine respect. Daniel's jaw clenched, though he kept his expression neutral, his calm demeanor giving no hint of the spark of frustration igniting within him. He wasn't one to make demands, but this was not about entitlement. It was about principle, about a fundamental sense of fairness. He took a slow breath, his words steady but with an unmistakable weight. "I'd like to speak with the pilot." The request hung in the air like a sudden gust, catching the supervisor off guard. For a moment, the man's practiced smile faltered, replaced by an expression of controlled discomfort. "Sir, there's no need to escalate the situation. I'm confident we can handle everything right here." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I insist." The supervisor hesitated, his reluctance evident as he glanced around, as if looking for a way out, a means to avoid the ripple effect of whatever he feared this conversation might bring. He had dismissed Daniel easily enough when he was just another passenger, someone whose inconvenience could be glossed over with corporate speak and a hollow apology. But now, with the subtle insistence in Daniel's tone, the supervisor seemed to realize that this was no ordinary traveler. With a terse nod, he turned and disappeared once more, leaving Daniel to wait, surrounded by curious onlookers who whispered among themselves, glancing his way with looks that ranged from curiosity to mild disapproval. He was used to it, the weight of those eyes, the quiet scrutiny that seemed to question his right to stand where he stood. But if they were waiting for him to lose his temper or make a scene, they would be disappointed. Several minutes later, a flight attendant approached him with a soft, apologetic smile, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Admiral Washington," she said, her voice almost a whisper, as if acknowledging his rank might shatter the fragile status quo. "The captain would like to speak with you. If you'll follow me?" He inclined his head in acknowledgement, allowing himself a moment to take in the effect of his title spoken aloud. The surrounding murmurs grew quieter, replaced by a mixture of awe and discomfort among those who had overheard. They seemed to realize that the man standing in the line, the one who'd been so casually dismissed, was not just anyone. He was Admiral Washington, a man whose authority and achievements they could only begin to imagine. As he followed the flight attendant toward the plane, he felt a quiet satisfaction, not because he had exerted his authority, but because, in this moment, he had refused to accept being treated as less. He wasn't here to flaunt his rank. He was here to remind the world, and perhaps even himself, of his worth that went far beyond a title, a uniform, or a reserved seat in first class. As Admiral Washington walked through the airport terminal, led by the flight attendant, a silence seemed to settle around him. Eyes followed his every step, heads turned, and whispers swirled in his wake. But he moved forward with the steady calm of someone who had spent years navigating storms far more dangerous than this. He'd come here for a simple flight home, and yet, as he approached the plane, it felt as if he were walking into another battle, one that demanded patience, strength, and a dignified resolve. The attendant led him through the gate, down the narrow jetway, and onto the plane, passing rows of passengers who glanced up at him, some with curiosity, others with unease. Each step toward the cockpit felt like peeling away layers of assumptions and prejudices, layers that had been placed on him by strangers who saw only the color of his skin, unaware of the responsibility, the commitment, the weight he carried in service to his country. At the entrance to the cockpit, Captain Mark Peterson stood waiting, a tall, sturdy man in his mid-50s. Peterson had the calm, unflinching presence of someone who had also spent years in command, albeit in a different arena. His uniform was impeccable, every crease sharp, every button polished. But as soon as he laid eyes on Daniel, recognition flashed in his gaze, followed by a swift shift in demeanor. "Admiral Washington," Captain Peterson said, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. There was respect in his eyes, the kind that couldn't be faked. "It's an honor, sir." Daniel returned the handshake firmly, his voice even as he replied, "Thank you, Captain. I understand there's been some confusion about my seat." The captain's brow furrowed as he listened to Daniel explain, his expression tightening with each detail. He glanced at the flight attendants who had gathered nearby, their faces tense with the weight of what was happening. The tension thickened, and Captain Peterson's jaw set, his tone growing more resolute. "This kind of oversight is unacceptable," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to leading with integrity. He turned to the nearest attendant. "Get the Admiral seated in first class immediately," he ordered, leaving no room for further excuses. "And make sure that any issues related to passenger assignments are handled with respect from now on. We treat all our passengers with dignity, especially those who've served our country at the highest levels." The attendants nodded and hurried to follow his command. But the gravity of the moment hung in the air. Daniel could see that the captain's words weren't just an apology. They were a promise to do better, a personal pledge to make things right. And though Captain Peterson's reaction wasn't unusual among those who had dedicated their lives to service, it struck Daniel as deeply meaningful in this moment, a moment when respect was both given and upheld without hesitation. "Thank you, Captain," Daniel said, his tone softening slightly. "I appreciate the gesture." The captain nodded, his eyes steady as he replied, "It's the least we can do, Admiral. Your service deserves more than empty apologies." As he was escorted back to first class, Daniel noticed the shift in the atmosphere. Passengers averted their eyes, some with a hint of embarrassment, others with newfound respect. Across the aisle, a businessman in a finely tailored suit glanced at him, then quickly looked away, his expression tinged with guilt. And Daniel could feel the ripple effect of the encounter, the silent acknowledgement, the recognition that perhaps they had misjudged him. A man who had stood quietly, holding his ground with dignity, when he finally settled into his seat. The plush comfort of first class a stark contrast to the tense moments at the check-in counter. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a quiet exhale. This seat was just a small token, a material comfort, but to him, it represented something much deeper, respect that he had earned. Respect that was due not only to him but to everyone who traveled, regardless of their background. The flight began its smooth ascent, the engines roaring to life as the world below faded into clouds. As they leveled out at cruising altitude, a flight attendant approached him, offering a drink and a quiet apology. Daniel accepted, nodding with a reserved smile, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered such a situation, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But each time it happened, each time he had to remind others of his worth, it brought him back to the reality that so many others, those without rank, those without titles, faced the same, or worse, without the privilege to speak up, to ask for a higher authority, to demand recognition. As the plane flew through the skies, he stared out the window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly below. In those clouds, he saw memories of battles won, sailors he had mentored, young soldiers who'd looked up to him with pride and admiration. And he thought of them now, hoping that the world they returned to would one day offer them the same respect they received in the Navy, a respect that went beyond ranks, titles, or uniforms. For now, he could only take this moment as another reminder. The fight for respect wasn't one that could be won in a single lifetime, and it wasn't always waged on distant shores or in the heat of combat. Sometimes, it took place quietly, in airports, in lobbies, and in waiting lines, and each time, he would stand his ground, not only for himself but for everyone who needed a reminder that they, too, deserved to be treated with dignity. As the flight attendants continued to move down the aisle, Daniel leaned back, letting his mind settle. There would be more moments like this, but he would meet them as he always had, head high, heart steady, and eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. As Admiral Washington settled into his first-class seat, a newfound calm enveloped him, though it was tinged with a lingering sense of disquiet. The quiet hum of the plane filled the cabin, a gentle backdrop to the murmur of passengers chatting in their seats. But Daniel was more attuned to the subtleties around him. From his vantage point, he could see the ripple effect his encounter had caused, the raised eyebrows, the sidelong glances, and the unmistakable discomfort etched on a few faces around him. Across the aisle, a man in an expensive business suit pretended to read his newspaper, though his gaze drifted over the edge now and then, observing Daniel as if he were studying an unfamiliar artifact. A couple in the row ahead glanced back, whispering quietly to each other, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and, perhaps, curiosity. Daniel met their eyes briefly, offering a small nod before returning his attention to the seat in front of him. He knew these looks well. They were the looks of people who, seconds ago, had likely dismissed him and were now recalibrating their assumptions. It was not the first time he had seen people reconsider him in this way, processing who he was, struggling to reconcile his casual attire with his presence in a place they assumed he didn't belong. The whispers were subtle, but the message was clear. Why was he here? Who was he? Really? Daniel took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had spent decades learning to ignore the sidelong glances, the unspoken judgments, and the guarded curiosity that followed him when he wasn't in uniform. It was something he had faced since his first days as a young black officer rising through the Navy ranks. Then, he had needed to prove himself over and over, his resilience chiseled by countless challenges. Now, he was an admiral, a leader with respect hard-won from every person who had served under him. But here, in this civilian space, none of that seemed to matter. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone on board, the familiar monotone easing the cabin into a state of relaxation. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to lean back, to let go of the tension, but his peace was quickly interrupted by a voice next to him. "Excuse me, are you an admiral?" Daniel turned to find a young man sitting across the aisle, his eyes wide with an awe that bordered on disbelief. He looked barely 20, dressed casually in jeans and a hoodie, his enthusiasm unguarded. "Yes, I am," Daniel replied, his voice warm but measured. The young man's face broke into a smile. "I thought so. I overheard the flight attendants mention it. That's incredible, sir." His words were filled with admiration, his gaze respectful. "Thank you for your service. Really, it's an honor to be on this flight with you." Daniel nodded appreciatively, his smile genuine. "Thank you, son. I appreciate that." The young man continued to look at him as if trying to commit the moment to memory, his expression a blend of respect and pride. Daniel could see the spark in his eyes, the way he looked at him as a symbol of possibility. It reminded him of the sailors he had led, the way they had trusted him, looked up to him, and how he, in turn, had worked to be worthy of that trust. But as Daniel glanced around, he noticed the contrasting expressions of those seated nearby, the reserved, uncertain faces, people who seemed less impressed and more discomfited by the situation. It was as if they were struggling with an inner conflict, trying to reconcile the image they had built in their minds of who could, and couldn't, hold such a title. In their world, admirals didn't look like him. Admirals wore crisp uniforms, commanded authority effortlessly, but they didn't blend in as ordinary men. Seated beside them on commercial flights, he met their eyes without hesitation, unflinching, but his heart felt a familiar pang. These were the silent battles he fought, ones that required no weapons or orders but demanded quiet strength. The glances, the whispers, the assumptions, they didn't challenge his rank, but they tested his resolve, reminding him of how far he had come and how far society still had to go. A flight attendant approached him, her expression a mixture of apology and genuine admiration. "Admiral Washington," she began softly, "please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable. We deeply apologize for the earlier oversight." Daniel gave a slight nod, appreciating the gesture, though he knew this apology, while genuine, was merely a band-aid on a deeper issue. He accepted the glass of water she handed him and glanced around once more, observing the shifting expressions of those nearby. Their reactions reminded him that, despite his rank, despite his achievements, he still faced the same quiet biases he'd encountered his entire life. As the flight drifted smoothly through the clouds, Daniel turned his attention to the world outside his window. Watching the landscape of clouds stretching endlessly below, he let himself drift, thinking about the sailors under his command, young men and women from all backgrounds, united by a shared purpose. In the Navy, respect was something earned through dedication, through sacrifice. But here, he was reminded that respect was sometimes withheld because of assumptions that ran too deep for titles to erase. And as he reflected, a quiet resolve settled within him. The world might see him as an exception, a black admiral who had defied odds, who had made it despite the barriers. But he wanted more than that. He wanted a world where no one had to prove their worth over and over, where respect was given freely and equally. This seat, this flight, this small confrontation, it was a reminder of the work still to be done, both on the seas he commanded and in the society he served. Closing his eyes, he breathed deeply, steadying himself for what lay ahead, the subtle battles he knew he would continue to face. And as he sat there, surrounded by murmurs and whispers, he resolved that he would meet each one with the same quiet strength, until respect became not a privilege, but a right for all. As the hours drifted by and the flight settled into a tranquil hum, Admiral Washington allowed himself a moment to unwind, leaning back in his seat and closing his eyes. But just as he began to settle, he sensed a presence nearby. He opened his eyes to find Captain Mark Peterson standing beside him, his expression earnest, his demeanor respectful. "Admiral Washington," the captain began, his voice lowered out of consideration for the passengers around them. "I wanted to personally apologize for the way things were handled earlier." Daniel straightened in his seat, nodding slowly as he took in the captain's apology. Peterson's face was sincere, his eyes reflecting an unspoken recognition of the wrong that had been done. Daniel could see that the captain's words were more than just a formality. They were rooted in genuine regret, a personal responsibility to make things right. The captain continued, his voice carrying a rare blend of humility and conviction. "I can't imagine how frustrating that must have been, sir. You deserve respect, not just as a high-ranking officer but as a person. We pride ourselves on treating all of our passengers with dignity, and I assure you this kind of situation won't happen again on my watch." For a moment, Daniel was silent, studying the captain's expression, his unwavering gaze. He sensed the weight behind Peterson's words, the sincerity of a man who understood the significance of respect, both in and out of uniform. It was a gesture that cut through the tension, one that reminded Daniel of the values he held close, the ones that had guided him through years of service, battles, and unyielding challenges. "Thank you, Captain," Daniel replied finally, his voice calm but filled with an appreciation that went beyond the surface. "Your words mean a great deal." It's not often that people take responsibility like this. The captain nodded, visibly relieved. But Daniel could see that Peterson was still affected by the incident, as if it had reminded him of something deeper, something beyond a simple passenger misplacement. Peterson's stance relaxed slightly, his hands folding together as he looked at Daniel with a quiet reverence. "You know, Admiral, I served for a few years myself," he admitted, a hint of pride in his voice. "Nowhere near your level, of course, but enough to understand what it means to dedicate oneself to something larger, to put in the work. I know that our service, our loyalty, it demands respect, and I regret that anyone on this flight would have treated you with anything less." Daniel gave him a nod, acknowledging the kinship that service often created. It was a bond that transcended ranks and titles, rooted in the shared understanding of sacrifice, discipline, and responsibility. The captain's words reminded him that there were people like Peterson, who understood the depth of what it meant to serve and the inherent respect that came with it. "I appreciate that, Captain," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "Respect should be a given, not something one has to prove time and time again." Peterson's gaze hardened, his jaw tightening as he nodded in agreement. "I'll be filing a report with the airline, Admiral. What happened today is a reflection of something we need to address. Not just for you but for every passenger who steps on board. This isn't just about rank. It's about treating people the way they deserve to be treated." Daniel saw the truth in Peterson's words, saw the man's determination to address the issue not as a single incident but as part of a larger conversation about respect and equality. The captain had recognized that the problem wasn't only about him. It was about the broader social reality that many still face daily. "Thank you, Captain," Daniel said quietly, a warmth in his voice that hinted at his own pride in Peterson's integrity. "If more people shared your sense of responsibility, we'd be moving in the right direction." As Captain Peterson excused himself and returned to the cockpit, Daniel watched him go, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. It wasn't often that he encountered someone willing to take accountability so directly, and it reminded him that, even in the midst of everyday prejudices, there were people willing to stand for what was right. The remaining hours of the flight passed smoothly, and though Daniel received a few more apologetic glances from the attendants, he felt an unexpected lightness, as if Peterson's apology had softened the edges of the earlier encounter. He leaned back, staring out the window at the endless stretch of clouds, his mind returning to the Navy, to the men and women he led, to the battles he had fought both abroad and at home. He thought of those who came before him, pioneers who had fought their own silent wars for respect and equality. He thought of the young officers under his command, those he had mentored, and those who would one day carry the torch forward. And he realized, as he sat there, that he was part of something much larger, a legacy of resilience, of quiet strength, of the unwavering determination to stand up for dignity, not just for himself but for everyone. As the plane began its descent, Daniel prepared himself to disembark, a quiet resolve in his heart. This journey wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about a reminder, a small but powerful message that, even in the smallest moments, one could stand up for what was right. And though this chapter of his journey was closing, he knew there would be more moments like this, moments that called for strength, for patience, and for a steady commitment to change. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Daniel gathered his belongings and stood, meeting the eyes of the attendants one last time. He could see a newfound respect in their expressions, a recognition that went beyond titles, beyond uniforms, and as he walked through the terminal, head held high, he felt the strength of his convictions solidify within him, a quiet but resolute reminder that the fight for respect was far from over. But it was one he was prepared to meet, day after day, moment after moment, with unyielding grace. Stepping off the plane and into the bustling airport terminal, Admiral Daniel Washington felt the familiar blend of noise and motion surround him. Travelers hurried past with suitcases trailing behind. Friends reunited with warm embraces. And businesspeople spoke into phones with the air of urgent importance. To any casual observer, Daniel was just another passenger, a man in civilian clothes walking purposefully through the crowd. But for him, this walk was a continuation of the journey he'd started long ago. A journey marked by moments like these, small but indelible marks on a life dedicated to both service and integrity. As he moved through the throng, Daniel felt the weight of the recent encounter settle in his mind. His path to becoming an admiral had been paved with obstacles. Yet he had pushed forward, not out of spite but out of an unwavering belief in the values he fought to uphold: fairness, honor, and respect. And today, those values had been tested, not by an external threat or a physical challenge, but by something as simple and insidious as subtle prejudice. He found a quiet corner near the terminal windows, away from the rush of people, and paused to gather his thoughts. Through the glass, he could see planes coming and going, rising into the skies or touching down, each carrying its own set of passengers, its own stories. Watching them, Daniel couldn't help but reflect on his own journey, on the many flights he had taken as a young officer, the countless hours spent in transit to far-off deployments, each trip a mission in its own right. But this trip, he realized, felt different. This wasn't about serving his country on distant shores. It was about navigating the complexities of respect and identity on his home soil. A soft voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to find a woman standing nearby, a warmth in her expression. She looked at him with an appreciative gaze, and in her hand, she clutched a small American flag pin. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice filled with sincerity. "I just wanted to say thank you. I overheard some of what happened on the plane, and I just wanted to let you know how much it means to see someone like you standing tall, showing what true dignity looks like." Daniel met her gaze, a quiet strength in his eyes. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot to me." He accepted the small flag pin she offered, feeling the surprising weight of her gratitude as he held it in his hand. For a moment, they stood there in a shared understanding, a brief but powerful connection. As she walked away, Daniel looked down at the pin, feeling the cool metal against his skin, and he was reminded of the countless people who had stood in silent solidarity with him over the years. People who recognized the strength it took to stand tall in the face of prejudice, to demand respect in quiet ways that left a lasting impact. The pin was a small gesture, but it held a profound meaning, a reminder that his fight for dignity was shared by others, seen and appreciated even when he felt alone. Lost in thought, Daniel nearly missed the approach of a young man dressed in a crisp airport uniform, looking at him with a mixture of respect and nervousness. "Admiral Washington?" the young man asked tentatively. "I just wanted to say it's an honor to meet you, sir. I've heard about everything you've accomplished. It's inspiring to see someone like you, someone who's broken barriers and shown us what true leadership looks like." Daniel nodded, a genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, son. I'm glad to hear that. Remember, the work you do, whether it's in uniform or out, is a part of that same legacy. Carry it forward with pride." The young man smiled, his shoulders straightening as he took Daniel's words to heart. "I will, sir. Thank you." He gave a respectful nod and stepped back, his admiration evident in the way he looked at Daniel, as if seeing more than just a decorated admiral. He saw a role model, someone who represented not only the military but the possibility of resilience and quiet power in the face of discrimination. As Daniel resumed his walk toward the exit, he reflected on the encounters that had punctuated his journey, each one a reminder of why he continued to stand up, why he refused to let himself be defined by the prejudices of others. It wasn't about proving himself anymore. He knew his worth. It was about setting an example for those who looked to him, about showing them that dignity was not negotiable, no matter the circumstances. Outside, the evening sun cast a warm glow over the tarmac, and Daniel felt a sense of calm wash over him. The airport was just one stop on his journey, but it had given him a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of the quiet battles that still needed to be fought. And he knew, as he stepped forward into the fading light, that he would continue to meet those challenges with the same resolve, carrying the strength of his experiences and the support of those who stood with him. As he left the terminal, Daniel held his head high, a quiet but unbreakable resolve shining in his eyes. This world, with all its complexities and biases, could throw what it wanted at him, but he would continue to walk his path with grace, knowing that each step he took was paving the way for others to follow. He would be their example, a reminder that true dignity, true strength, was in standing tall even, and especially, in the face of those who tried to make you feel small. As Daniel exited the airport, the crisp evening air greeted him, carrying with it a quiet sense of relief and clarity. The sun had dipped just below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of amber and indigo, and he took a moment to appreciate the stillness outside the busy terminal. He had weathered battles that day, not in combat but in the subtle, relentless way that tested his resilience and conviction. And now, as he stepped back into the world, he felt the familiar strength that had carried him through decades of service. Walking toward the curb to catch a ride home, Daniel couldn't help but replay the day's events in his mind. He thought about the moments that could have broken his patience, the assumptions that had been made about him, the indifferent tone of the attendant, and the supervisor's rehearsed excuses. These experiences were far too familiar, not just for him but for countless others who navigated a world often too quick to judge and too slow to listen. But as he reflected, he also thought about the moments of grace he had encountered, the sincere apology from Captain Peterson, the warmth from the woman who had handed him the small American flag pin, and the respect in the young airport worker's eyes. These reminders of kindness and understanding had softened the edges of his frustration, grounding him in a sense of purpose that went beyond his personal pride. Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of his car, a black sedan that glided smoothly to a stop in front of him. The driver, a middle-aged man with a friendly smile, stepped out and greeted him warmly. "Good evening, sir." "Where to?" the driver asked, his tone respectful but relaxed. Daniel settled into the back seat and provided his address. Leaning back as the car pulled away from the terminal, he watched the airport lights fade into the distance, the reflections of streetlights gliding across the windows like distant stars. There was a comfort in the silence of the ride, a chance to let his mind drift freely, to take stock of everything he'd experienced that day. As they drove, the driver glanced back at him in the rearview mirror, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "If you don't mind me asking, sir, are you in the military?" Daniel met the driver's gaze in the mirror and nodded. "I am." The driver's expression shifted to one of admiration. "Thank you for your service, sir. My father was in the Navy, too. Taught me everything I know about respect and hard work." Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth in the driver's words. It was in moments like these that he felt the true weight of his role, not just as an admiral but as part of a legacy that extended through generations of men and women who had chosen to serve. His mind drifted to those under his command, the sailors who trusted him, who looked up to him for guidance and strength. Their loyalty, their sacrifices, were what gave his position meaning. They rode in comfortable silence for a few more miles until Daniel finally spoke. His voice reflective. "Respect and hard work. They're the foundation of a life well lived. It's men like your father who built that foundation, brick by brick." The driver nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "That's true, sir. And it's people like you who keep it standing strong." As the car approached his neighborhood, Daniel felt a quiet resolve settle over him, solidifying with each passing moment. The events of the day had left him with a clearer vision of his purpose, a reminder that his role as a leader went beyond the walls of military strategy rooms or the boundaries of naval ships. It extended into the everyday, into small encounters, into the spaces where people looked to him not only as an admiral but as a man who had chosen to carry himself with dignity in all things. When the car pulled up to his house, Daniel thanked the driver, stepping out into the cool evening air. He watched as the car pulled away, the headlights disappearing down the quiet street, and then turned to his home. The porch light glowed warmly, illuminating the path to his front door, and as he approached, he felt a sense of peace. This was his sanctuary, his refuge from the battles of the day, a place where he could set aside the weight of rank and simply be. But even here, as he crossed the threshold, Daniel knew that his resolve would not rest. There would be more battles to face, more quiet confrontations in the world that tested his patience and his belief in justice, and he was prepared to meet each one, carrying with him the strength of his experiences, the lessons he had learned, and the unbreakable conviction that respect and dignity were non-negotiable. In the stillness of his home, Daniel placed the small American flag pin on the table by the door, letting it catch the soft light as a quiet reminder of the day's events. He knew it was a small symbol, but it held a weight that was deeply personal, a symbol of the resilience he carried and the legacy he was committed to upholding. As he settled into his evening routine, Daniel felt the quiet strength of his purpose radiate from within. It was a strength that had been shaped by years of service, by moments of grace, and by the simple, unwavering belief that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through every battle. And as he prepared for the days to come, he knew he would walk forward with his head held high, a steadfast reminder that dignity and respect were, and always would be, worth standing up for. The following morning, the sun rose over Admiral Daniel Washington's quiet neighborhood, casting a warm, golden light that seeped through his kitchen window as he sipped his coffee. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind, not as a burden, but as a series of lessons, each one reinforcing the principles he held dear. He looked down at the small American flag pin on the table, a token given by a stranger yet carrying the weight of silent support, a reminder that his journey was not one he walked alone. Today, like most days, he would return to his duties, donning his uniform with the symbols of his rank and responsibility. But this morning, as he pinned on his insignias, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, as if each moment of quiet strength, each instance of dignity he upheld, had transformed into something larger. It was no longer just about him. It was about everyone who saw his actions, who saw in him a reflection of their own quiet battles for respect and recognition. When he arrived at his office, Daniel found a familiar stack of papers waiting on his desk: reports, strategic updates, personnel files, all reminders of the daily demands of his role. Yet, beneath the familiar rhythm of his work, a new determination hummed within him, as if his experiences had sharpened his focus, guiding him toward something deeper. Just as he settled in, a knock came at his door. He looked up to see Lieutenant Carlos Ramirez, one of his most promising officers, standing at attention with a respectful nod. "Good morning, Admiral," Ramirez said, his voice steady yet carrying a hint of admiration. "I wanted to speak with you about something, if you have a moment." Daniel motioned for him to enter. Curious, Ramirez stepped in, closing the door behind him, and took a seat. The young officer's gaze was resolute but held a vulnerability that Daniel recognized instantly, an openness that came only when trust had been earned. "Admiral, I wanted to thank you," Ramirez began, his words careful but sincere. "Yesterday, I heard about what happened at the airport. A few of us did, actually. It's not every day that we get to witness someone in your position standing up against that kind of quiet discrimination." Daniel listened, letting Ramirez's words settle. He hadn't realized that the news had reached others in his circle. But as he looked into the young officer's eyes, he saw the impact his actions had made. Ramirez continued, his voice steadying as he spoke. "Your example, it means a lot, sir. Not just to me, but to so many of us who look up to you. We see the strength in how you handle yourself, not just on the field or in the briefing room, but in moments like these, where others might not even notice. It's a reminder that what we stand for goes beyond rank or protocol." Daniel felt a quiet pride in Ramirez's words, a pride rooted not in himself but in the growth and integrity of the men and women he led. He gave a slight nod, allowing a small smile to show. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Daniel replied, his tone warm but purposeful. "I appreciate that more than you know. But remember, the strength we show out there, in the day-to-day challenges, is just as important as the decisions we make in here. Respect isn't something that should be conditional. It's something we give and expect in return, no matter who we are or where we come from." Ramirez nodded, his expression reflecting a deeper understanding, as if Daniel's words had sparked a new clarity within him. "Yes, sir. It's a lesson I won't forget." They spoke for a few more minutes, discussing not only the challenges Ramirez faced but the shared purpose that bound them as officers, as leaders, as men determined to make a difference. When Ramirez finally left, Daniel felt a sense of satisfaction, a quiet knowledge that the torch he carried was one he would pass on to others like Ramirez, who would take that same light and continue to push for change. As the day wore on, Daniel carried this sense of resolve with him. In meetings, he led with the same quiet strength he had embodied the previous day, listening with intention, speaking with purpose. His actions were small, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but those who looked closely saw a man who understood the weight of his role, who walked with a dignity that could not be shaken. That evening, as he prepared to leave his office, Daniel felt a calm satisfaction settle over him. The day had been long, but it had been meaningful in ways that extended far beyond the paperwork and meetings. He had faced another day with resilience, had inspired others not by grand gestures but through the steady strength of his example. As he exited the building, Daniel looked out at the twilight settling over the base, the stars beginning to dot the sky. He thought of those who had come before him, those who had paved the way, and those who would follow in his footsteps. His legacy, he realized, would not be measured by medals or accolades but by the quiet dignity he upheld in each moment, the silent battles he fought so that others wouldn't have to. And as he walked toward his car, his head held high, Admiral Daniel Washington knew that this journey, this fight for respect, equality, and unwavering dignity was one he would continue, one quiet step at a time, until his last. For he understood now, more deeply than ever, that each step was not just for him, but for those who looked to him as a reminder of what true strength looked like. This was his legacy, this was his purpose, and he would carry it forward, torch in hand, for as long as he was able.